Give Me Liberty. This is the United States and the Cold War from 1945 to 1953. Now, the Cold War lasts much longer than this, but this is the time period that we're talking about for right now. And it'll be split off because that's the end of the Korean War. So we're moving from the end of World War II through the end of the Korean War with this chapter. It starts out talking about the Freedom Train. In 1947, there was this 160th anniversary of the U.S. Constitution, because remember that was made about a decade after independence. And there were 133 historically important documents, historically important to the United States anyway, that rode around on this train for a 16-month tour of the nation. Some of the documents were as big as the Mayflower Compact. If you'll remember, this is the first written form of government in what is now the United States, written on the Mayflower before people disembarked, and the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address. Notably, the National Archives had wanted to include 20th century social legislation like the 14th and 15th Amendments, and those guarantee the right to citizenship for those born here and voting rights. And they also wanted to include the Four Freedoms speech, the Wagner Act, and all sorts of different social legislation that had happened in the past couple of decades. But the American Heritage Foundation denied these documents being on board with the other ones. They're a much more conservative group, and they weren't a fan of these more liberal in the modern sense documents and what they had meant to the nation. One notable achievement for this, other than having all of these documents together, which is amazing in itself, is that the train would not allow, those running the train would not allow for segregated viewings. This actually led to cancellations in the Deep South where they required segregation in public settings. And those running the train decided not to visit those places if they were going to require segregation. So that's a celebration of the nation in itself, following World War II, in which the U.S. was victorious, part of the victorious party of the Allies. This moves us into the Cold War. This is mainly the United States versus the Soviet Union, and there were many proxy battles over what are called third world countries. You've probably heard that term. What that actually means is that they were neither allied with the United States or the Soviet Union, but they were sort of this third option. And both the Soviet Union and the United States were attempting to influence these so-called third world countries to get them to be on their side, either for communism or against communism. You can see in the map on the left here, it has the three world order. So this is that third world countries. So blue and red are the United States and the Soviet Union. And then everything in tan was what they were fighting over, essentially. The United States had the idea that they would be able to use this concept of containment. They wanted to keep communism from spreading any further than it already had, but not necessarily go into the Soviet Union to overturn communism. They didn't want to get into another world war, essentially, but they didn't want communism to spread throughout. In 1946, the Long Telegram noted that communism would spread if the United States didn't stop it. They were the only other power that could go head-to-head with the Soviet Union post-war. So most of Europe had been decimated throughout World War II, so the largest powers on the top were the Soviet Union and the United States. You've probably also heard the term the Iron Curtain, and this refers to the Free West being split from the communist-ruled East. This is how it's categorized. Obviously, we know there are some complications and there's some nuance involved in discussing the West as free, but this is the major division between the two. The Truman Doctrine was put into place by President Truman, obviously. You can tell from the name. And this was essentially the United States moving forward and providing money to governments and people who would be against anti-communism or against communism. They would be anti-communists. Britain had stepped back following World War II due to the devastation that was suffered on the continent, and Truman stepped up to fill this gap with the United States. In 1947, the CIA was created under this Truman Doctrine in order to garner intelligence and perform secret military missions abroad. The U.S. government essentially portrayed the U.S. and Western Europe as the bastion of freedom, and the communist government in the Soviet Union as sort of this ultimate evil. The Marshall Plan was part of an attempt to right the world, essentially, following World War II. It's named for Secretary of State George C. Marshall, and it was unveiled in 1947 as a plan for the U.S. to invest billions of dollars in Europe to help them recover and rebuild so that communism wouldn't spread into desperate parts of the continent. So they were hoping that by helping to rebuild these countries, they would be more resistant to the influence of the Soviet Union. This particular plan was not openly billed as being anti-communist, but instead they said it was against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. But the reality is they wanted to fix those things so that the communists wouldn't come in and try to fix them and gain their allegiance. Western Europe did begin to improve and begin to recover from the war, but Eastern Europe did not, and largely fell under Soviet rule. And this created both financial and social divides on the continent. The Allies and the Soviets, the remaining Allies and the Soviets had split Berlin and even used a different currency in each zone. So they had military zones in Germany, and it was split between the European and US allies and the Soviet Union. There was this East and West Germany. They were separate nations until 1991 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany. So this lasted for quite some time. Japanese reconstruction was also required following the war. And General Douglas MacArthur actually served as the supreme commander in Japan until 1948, when Japan adopted a democratic constitution. So the United States was controlling Japan through a military government until 1948. Under this new democratic constitution, women gained the right to vote in Japan, and that had been and remained controversial for a while. They weren't intending to necessarily open that up to women. They were also forced to renounce warfare as an option for solving their international problems, essentially. They were required to reduce the size of their armed forces as part of this renunciation of warfare as well. The United States was particularly invested in Japan's recovery because they also feared a communist push, and they wanted a democratically based ally in East Asia so that they had sort of a jumping off point should they need to go into what people often will say is a hot war, so a live war. NATO was also created at this time, and the Soviet Union prompted this by testing their own atomic bomb in 1949. So the reality became two nations, the most powerful at the time, had access to the deadliest weapon known to humankind. In order to create a board to protect this peace that they saw that could easily fall apart, the United States, Canada, and 10 other European nations joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. You've likely heard of this, it still exists. And they pledged mutual defense of one another against the Soviet Union. So this is to say, if the Soviet Union attacked one of them, that the others would be called into action as well. And this same sort of alliance was created in Eastern Europe under the Warsaw Pact of 1955. So you can see on the map to the left, the founding members are in the darkest blue. So those are the United States, Canada, and those 10 European nations. And then there were a smattering of countries that joined in the following decades. So it is bigger than that initial 12-country membership, but it still remains an important alliance for most of the countries involved today. Communism was this concept that had been thrown around for decades at this point, and what it essentially means at its core is it's a society in which all of the wealth is owned collectively and all resources are shared. This is obviously in theory. It's also meant to be egalitarian, so meaning there wouldn't be class structures and there wouldn't be gender structures. But in real life, it doesn't always pan out this way. This is the basic theory of it. Of course, it's much more complicated than that, and any time it's been rolled out, it's much more complicated than that, just like democracy is more complicated and socialism is more complicated. In 1949, Mao Zedong, the Communist Party leader, won the Chinese Civil War, and the West considered this to be a loss of China. This meant that the nation became the People's Republic of China and experienced a lot of political strife following the war and continues to have resentment from many citizens even today under this communist government. In 1950, the National Security Council made permanent the military buildup to fight communism. So they always wanted to have this standing army ready to go in case they needed to go to war with the Soviet Union. The Korean War is one of the proxy wars that we were talking about. So Korea was divided after the Japanese occupation during World War II, with North Korea falling to the Soviet communist rule and South Korea falling as an ally of the United States and was anti-communist but not necessarily democratic. In June of 1950, South Korea was invaded by the North in order to attempt to reunify the country under communism. So they wanted the country to come back together as one nation, but to be under communist rule. President Truman convinced the UN Security Council to approve military action, and in September of 1950, General MacArthur's troops invaded North Korea. There were many battles. You can watch entire documentaries. You could probably do an entire semester on the Korean War. And eventually there's this stalemate at the infamous 38th parallel, and this divides the two nations. This is oftentimes called the Forgotten War. People don't talk about it much in U.S. history classes, and part of the reason for that is because this is the beginning of a series of losses of wars. It's also relatively short compared to the other wars surrounding it, but it's one of the few times up until that point where there just had to be this truce. Essentially, the War of 1812 was the same way. Nothing was really gained, nothing lost. But in this case, the U.S. troops just had to stop fighting. There was no win. The armistice that was called in 1953 stopped the active fighting, but there was no treaty that was ever actually ending the war. We're still seeing the effects of that today. The two nations are still at odds with each other. It's still essentially if you threw a match in a barrel, and the United States is still involved. Throughout the war, 33,000 American soldiers were killed, 1 million Korean soldiers were killed, and 2 million Korean civilians were killed. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese died as well. So while it's not talked about very much, those are relatively large numbers for a relatively small nation and relatively short war. So acknowledging that this is the beginning of a string of losses or unclear victories or truces even in the wars to come, people have held a sort of shame about this. It seems to be getting better as the years move on, and we can acknowledge further that this is just the way that things happen sometimes. There isn't always going to be this unifying war in some cases. Some people might describe it that way. In World War II, where there was this good war, so it had a clear bad guy, a clear good guy, and it was considered a just war. A lot of the rest of these weren't necessarily considered that clear cut. So you can see on this map there are phases of the Korean War, and the area occupied by communist forces is in yellow, and the area occupied by UN forces is in green. So you can see it starts out mostly yellow. The UN forces do quite well and move up into North Korea and take over a lot of land. And then they're pushed back down by the communist forces. And then there's this armistice line at the 38th parallel. While all of these proxy wars are happening and all of these questions follow World War II, there are questions about imperialism in general and about decolonization of European colonies specifically. Colonial independence movements use the language of the U.S. Declaration of Independence to essentially announce their cause and their hopes. And what they wanted was exactly what that document guaranteed people. And they saw it as basic rights and basic freedoms. This isn't the first time that the American Revolution took a hold of other nations' thoughts and inspired them to fight for freedom. We saw that in Latin America following the American Revolution, and we also saw this in France. And decolonization was a huge goal for a few decades in the 20th century. And this is the return of power to the people. And this was favored by most Democrats and most African American leaders in the United States as well. And part of the argument of that is that the free world should be just that. It should be free. By ruling from Europe and these other nations, it was showing that they didn't believe that these other nations could survive on their own and that they felt like they were still in charge of their resources. The U.S. partnered with nations that were in agreement about going after communism. So if they were interested in becoming a nation relying only on themselves and not on a colonial power, the U.S. was willing to help support them if they would also vow to be anti-communist following their freedom. Hollywood and cultural censorship made it so that the United States looked better than it was, and communism looked like pure evil. Obviously, as with most things, there's some gray area here. Um, Neither thing is entirely true, and neither thing is entirely false. So, totalitarianism is defined as ideologically driven states that sought to subsue all of civil society, including churches, unions, and other voluntary organizations. So this means a society that's attempting to control the social, financial, and um, the international presence of a nation. Everything that Moscow did was categorized as evil and against freedom. The word socialism was invoked during these times to equate all socialist policies to communist policies. So while there are differences, pretty stark differences, between socialism and communism, there was an attempt to equate them in order to avoid socialist policies from moving up the ladder in the United States. One of those things that Truman attempted to propose was national health insurance. And the American Medical Association ended up fighting off this program by scaring the people with the concept of socialism, and they equated it to communism, which was equated with pure evil. The National Health Insurance Program would have made the United States like all of the other developed nations. They all provide some basic form of health insurance to all of their citizens. Human rights were also on the rise at this point. So this concept of human rights, instead of particular freedoms for particular people, they were trying to say that there are some things that all countries likely agree on as basic human rights. So the Nuremberg trials are particularly famous at this point. They took place at the beginning of this time frame, and that was, as we talked about before, when they put many of the Nazi officials on trial, and some were executed and some were jailed. But it was widely publicized, and people were watching others get jail sentences and execution orders based on their violation of human rights. And it was things that most people agreed were just abhorrent. In 1948, the UN General Assembly, led by a commission headed by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, came up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You can see her holding it on the left here. And this said that the UN believed the following things were essential: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, protection against an arbitrary government, a decent standard of living, health care, and education. I've included a link here for you. It's about 8 pages long in a PDF format if you want to read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I definitely suggest that you do. These are important documents that actually still apply to all of us. In this case, however, there is no enforcement mechanism for this declaration, but it's something that people can look at and get an idea of what several different countries coming together and thinking about basic human rights were able to come up with and agree upon. Both the United States and the Soviet Union denied any real outside authority over their own national laws and national affairs. So this is also part of the reason the United States is not part of the International Criminal Court, because they don't believe in submitting to an international body that could perhaps override their own national laws. It's one of the few countries in the world that is not part of the International Criminal Court. That should be noted. And in 1948, with this, following the Nuremberg trials and with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in clear view, genocide also became a crime that would be punishable by law. It was defined, and it became a punishable offense at this point. So it was different than just manslaughter, it was different than just murder, it was an attempt to eradicate a group of people. The Fair Deal is something like the New Deal that we've talked about already, but this is essentially Truman's version. There were 12 million men who were still in uniform after the end of the war in August 1945. And there had to be some sort of plan to bring the size of the forces down and deal with what would be a more balanced peacetime force. The divorce rate doubled following World War II, and couples had been separated, sometimes for years, with little contact. And also, many of the men came back from the war changed, and life had moved on without them. So lots of people ended up getting divorced and because they were unhappy with the people they became or the people their partners became. When men re-entered the workforce following the war, they pushed out about 2 million women who were fired to accommodate the men. So this is tied in with the Fair Deal because it means providing jobs for those who were returning. In September of 1945, Truman put forth this Fair Deal, which was meant to improve the social safety net, raise the standard of living, increase the minimum wage, create national health insurance, allowance for public housing, and increase Social Security and aid to education. So it was trying to expand on what had already been created under the New Deal. There were, as there tend to be in every decade, labor uprisings. In 1946, there was a national wave of protests. Operation Dixie, which was backed by the CIO and the AFL, was attempting to bring unions to the South. The South had been extremely resistant in allowing unions in their factories, and more than 200 organizers entered the region in order to try to unite textile, steel, and agricultural workers and convincing them to ask for their rights from their employers. There were mass walkouts demanding wage increases so that people could more actively participate in this consumer economy that had come to life during the war. They wanted this economy to keep going. They wanted people to keep buying things. They wanted to be able to keep advertising things to people. And if they had higher pay, they'd be able to buy more things. There was also notably a large walkout of steelworkers where about 750,000 people walked out in total across the nation at once. The Taft-Hartley Act was passed in 1947 over President Truman's veto, meaning he vetoed it and then it was passed anyway. And this reversed a lot of the gains that were made by organized labor. It allowed for the president to suspend strikes with this cooling off period that could last up to 80 days, and it outlawed the closed shop. So closed shop means that it was a union shop, and they call this the right to work. This meant that you didn't need to join the union to work at that place. It also demanded that people take an oath saying that they were not a communist. So loyalty oath, essentially. And this will come up over and over. Civil rights was also starting to bud out as a more unified movement in this time frame. From 1945 to 1951, there were 11 states that established fair employment, and many cities passed local laws that were anti-discrimination laws regarding public places and employment. So even though it wasn't necessarily nationally recognized, people thought that if they could change it on the smaller levels, it would eventually make its way through the national Congress. And we saw this with women being able to vote. It went state to state. We saw this We saw this with African Americans being able to vote from state to state. We saw this with the outlaw of slavery, state to state. It seems to be how big things make their way to the top. We'll likely see this within the next few years for the legalization of marijuana that's been going state to state, and likely it will become a federal reality within the next few years. By the 1950s, there were some improvements in voting conditions depending on the region or state, and the number of lynchings decreased. But still, this left the majority of African Americans living in poverty-stricken, discriminatory communities, and this includes all the fear that comes with that. One success story at the time is Jackie Robinson. In 1947, he integrated baseball by joining up with the Brooklyn Dodgers. And he had faced adversity before this and continued to face adversity as a player on the team even. When he was in the Army, he'd been tried and acquitted for not having moved to the back of the bus when a white passenger boarded the same bus at Fort Hood. So even though he was in the military, he was expected to move to the back of the bus to make way. And he didn't. And he did promise to change his tune some in order to be on the Dodgers. So he was not to react to fans and other players who would say horribly racist things to him. And for the most part, he was able to let those things roll off and serve as an important role model for a lot of people, and not only in sports, but in general, with the idea of desegregation. In October of 1947, the Commission on Civil Rights published To Secure These Rights, which discussed, quite frankly, the situation of racial inequality in the United States. They called on the federal government to ensure desegregation in public areas, and Truman tried to pass laws related to this in 1948 by attempting to make the Civil Rights Commission permanent. He wanted to make federal laws against lynching and poll taxes, and he wanted to take action to secure fair job and educational opportunities. And the Korean War was the first war that had an integrated armed forces from the United States. And since the Revolutionary War, there had been some integration at that point, but for the most part, this was the first time that it was thought out and on purpose and for the purposes of desegregation. Southern Democrats were often bothered by the idea of moving forward with the expansion of civil rights. It would obviously upset the power balance in the Deep South by changing race relationships. Governor Strom Thurmond ran for president under what was called the States' Rights Democratic Party, which maintained a platform of racial segregation. So he wanted to keep the rights with the states to determine their own segregation policies. And opposing him was Vice President Henry Wallace, and he was running in the Progressive Party. You also had President Truman running again. But the Progressive platform focused on the expansion of the social programs and also the end of racial segregation. They were also interested in having some international control over nuclear weapons rather than just having the United States and the Soviet Union have control over them. They were also hoping to help the hostilities between the United States and the Soviet Union to die down because they saw what could potentially happen if they kept this tinderbox open. National security was the stated reason for many of the harsh governmental actions that were taken, or large-scale actions that were taken. They don't even necessarily have to be harsh, but the highway system and aid to higher education, improvements in technology, and the improvements in technology generally funneled through the military, industrial, and now people oftentimes add educational complex onto this. It's this it's a symbiotic loop where the military needs something, industry makes it, and universities sometimes are funded in order to research what is needed and what would work and come up with new ideas. Refugees from communism did not have the same limit as to how many could enter the United States, while other groups of refugees and immigrants still had quotas. So they were taking in anyone who stated they were anti-communist, essentially, or if they were in danger of being killed by the communists. The United States continued to have this black eye with Jim Crow existing in the South, and on the international stage, they were called out for this over and over again, and acknowledging the hypocrisy of maintaining racial segregation while suggesting that the entire world should be free. Loyalty was a huge focus during the Cold War. If one was linked to communism in any way, they were considered to be an enemy of freedom and an enemy of the state. McCarthyism, which you're likely familiar with, is named for Joseph McCarthy, but it actually precedes him and outlives him in his time in power. One of the more notorious stories that's finally getting some coverage in the public realm is the Lavender Scare. This took place in this time frame, and thousands of LGBT or suspected LGBT government employees were fired from their jobs with the acknowledgement that that was the reason for their firing. They didn't come up with another reason to fire them, or they didn't come up with some weird way around it by making a poll tax or a literacy test like they had done before with laws. They just said outright, we're firing you because you're a known or suspected homosexual, and the government said that they believed that LGBT people would have been more susceptible to blackmail if they were attempting to cover up this part of their lives. And it was still not socially acceptable in most cases to stray from the cis-hetero relationships that were portrayed largely throughout Hollywood and general social culture at the time. I've included a clip here on the Lavender Scare for you, and PBS actually just did a special about it, and that's what this poster's from on the left here. But it's notable that this happened and that most people were unaware of it. And knowing that social history has become more popular, people are more willing to look at the different facets that make up our history. And LGBT history is one of those areas that's coming into focus with the rise in gender studies and the rise in social history combined. There were also several famous spy trials. Whittaker Chambers was the editor of Time magazine, and he gave testimony for HUAC. Remember, this is the House Un-American Activities Committee. In the 1930s, Alger Hiss, who was a State Department official, gave him government documents to pass along to Soviet agents. Alger Hiss ended up being sentenced to 5 years in prison, and notably, Richard Nixon was one of the main pursuers in this case, and it's how he made a name for himself. Probably the most infamous incident during this time frame is the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were a working class Jewish communist couple from New York City, and they were accused mainly by her brother of passing along secrets of the atomic bomb to the Soviets. Years later, there's been proof that Julian was likely involved to some degree, but by no means gave the Soviets the secret to the bomb. He may have sped up their process, but he didn't. He's not the reason that they have it. And Ethel, on the other hand, there's still no evidence against her. Regardless of the level of evidence or the consequences of that evidence, they were both executed in 1953, despite widespread international protest and national protest. There's a clip that I've included here from the Smithsonian on the Rosenbergs, and there are multiple books written on them and multiple documentaries on them, so you wouldn't have a hard time looking into that if you were interested in knowing more. Fear was the name of the game at this point. There were state and local committees that functioned much like HUAC, and they demanded loyalty oaths from professionals like teachers and pharmacists and other professionals, saying that they were not communists. Books were also heavily censored, and some were even banned outright, like Robin Hood, for example, which was banned for being a story about taking from the rich to give to the poor. So this redistribution of wealth was termed as socialism, which was equated with communism. This fear was instilled in the people, and this fear was used to hold up other policies and governmental actions. One is FBI expansion. So the FBI was expanded to be able to investigate the Soviet Union, but that has other repercussions as well. Businesses were essentially ruining unions at this point, and we're saying that those within union ranks were socialists or communists. And there was also a strong religious enforcement of sexuality and gender roles. And this was held up saying that the communist government was the egalitarian one, and the communist government would infiltrate through homosexuals, like during the Lavender Scare. And they had all these ideas that if one was living the ideal American life at the time, and having the nuclear family, if you will, of the mom, the dad, and the 2.5 children, all that would make the United States essentially win this Cold War. In 1954, the military actually invaded Mexican-American neighborhoods under this operation that they called Operation Wetback, which is a derogatory term used against Latino people. But that's what they actually called their operation. And about 1 million people were deported to Mexico within 1 year. Even with all of these fears, segregation continued, and the U.S. is still the only developed nation not to provide basics like healthcare and higher education. We talked a little bit about civil rights rising up during this time, and this affluent society that was on the rise for many people in the nation had skipped over certain populations, for example, African Americans. Racial inequality had played into Russian hands up until this point, but it was difficult still to criticize the U.S. from inside the U.S. because of cracking down on those critical of the government. There continued to be segregation in schools and housing and job opportunities, And the gap between whites and non-whites expanded at this point because whites were moving up in ranks. They were being supported by these government programs, and African Americans either remained where they were or fell even lower without this extra support that was being given to other citizens.